The winter of 1978 carried a strange stillness over Beijing, the kind that settles before a nation exhales after decades of turmoil. In the quiet wait of that moment, an old man stepped again into the light of power, short in stature, but with eyes that burned like sharpened steel. Deng Xiaoping, 74 years old and walking with the deliberate certainty of someone who knew exactly what he wanted from history, returned not as a shadow of the past but as the architect of China's uncertain future. For many, his presence alone felt like a rupture. The memory of Mao Zedong, vast and suffocating, still hung over the land like the ghost of a storm that had wrecked everything in its path. But Deng was different, brisk, candid, and disarmingly plain-spoken. He did not pretend to be a god. He did not speak in thunder or poetry. He spoke like a man who understood suffering, survival, and the practical mechanics of power. In him, millions sensed a possibility, not liberation perhaps, but direction. He believed that only the party could shepherd China to prosperity. But he also believed, stubbornly, that China must change, must shed the rigidity that had left its people hungry and its cities asleep. At his side stood two men he trusted like his own limbs, Yao Bang and Zhao Jiang, his left and right hands, as he privately called them. Together they planted the seeds of what would be known as the four modernizations: agriculture, industry, national defense, and science and technology. In their vision, China would not lurch blindly into the future, it would build it. But beneath that cautious optimism, something restless stirred in the hearts of ordinary Chinese. The air had shifted. Even the walls seemed to listen. Beijing's Shedan Street soon began to change, not with banners or soldiers, but with paper. Large sheets pasted on stone and brick. Sharp black characters shouting grievances, long swallowed. The place became known as Democracy Wall, a mosaic of frustration and hope. Deng allowed it at first. People had suffered. They deserved to speak. Let them criticize the Gang of Four. Let them curse the mistakes of the past. As long as the anger was pointed backward, not upward, it posed no real danger. He told an American journalist calmly, "People have grievances, and they should be allowed to express them." His tone implied a man confident that he could hold the reins. But revolutions never stay within the lines drawn for them. In December 1978, a thin electrician named Wei Jingsheng stepped into history with the tremor of a man who has decided fear is no longer worth obeying. A former Red Guard, disillusioned and scarred, he wrote an essay titled The Fifth Modernization. But unlike others, he did not hide behind anonymity. He signed his real name, he wrote his real address, and he wrote words that landed like a stone through the window of the state. Democracy, freedom, and happiness for all are our sole objectives in carrying out modernization. To Wei, modernization without democracy was a body without a soul. It was in that bold act, simple, almost naive, that the invisible boundary of Deng's tolerance snapped. Wei Jingsheng and more than 30 others were arrested. Some disappeared into silence. Others re-emerged only after long sentences had bent their youth into something unrecognizable. The message was unmistakable. There would be reform, yes, but not rebellion. Freedom of speech, but not freedom to challenge the throne. A few months later, Deng articulated what the country soon understood as the immovable pillars of the new era. The four basic principles: the socialist road, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the party's leadership, and the doctrine of Marx, Lenin, and Mao. Whatever illusions remained were buried beneath those words. And yet, beneath the firmness of his voice, Deng was already assembling a transformation that would reorder the lives of hundreds of millions. Not a revolution of banners and flames, but of markets, investment, and opportunity in upheaval, quiet as a seed splitting below the soil. China was preparing to reinvent itself. The winter fog had barely lifted when Deng Xiaoping turned his gaze outward beyond Beijing's gray skyline, beyond the memory of isolation that had imprisoned China for decades. He was an old man, yet his resolve carried the sharp edge of youth. He wanted the world, and he wanted the world to want China. In early 1979, the impossible happened. Deng Xiaoping boarded a plane bound for the United States. The first such visit by a Chinese leader since 1943, the world watched with the curiosity reserved for encounters between civilizations long estranged. When Deng stepped onto American soil, he wore a simple coat and the half-smile of someone determined not to be underestimated. He shook hands with presidents, toured factories, and observed technology with the keen eyes of a mechanic taking apart a machine he intended to rebuild at home. In Texas, he donned a cowboy hat coldly, enthusiastically, and the crowds erupted in delight. The image sped across newspapers worldwide, a small Chinese leader with a broad hat and a broader grin. It was the smile of a man making a point without saying a word. China, he was signaling, would not hide anymore. Prosperity was his mission, not just the removal of hunger, but the creation of a middle class where none existed. His vision had a name that puzzled some and inspired others. Socialism with Chinese characteristics, a phrase vague enough to survive scrutiny, yet bold enough to shake the foundations of the old system. Under this new banner, the iron grip of state control loosened for the first time. Markets stirred like animals waking from hibernation. Prices, once dictated by bureaucratic decree, began to respond to the dance of supply and demand. Factories were encouraged to stand on their own feet. Local officials, once mere extensions of Beijing's will, were given room to decide, experiment, fail, and try again. But Deng's most daring invention lay ahead: the creation of special economic zones. Carved into the southern coast like gateways to dreams China had never dared to dream. Shenzhen was barely a town then, a scattering of fields and fishing villages only a stone's throw from vibrant, capitalist Hong Kong. Deng looked at its sleepy skyline and saw a future roaring to be born. Let it grow, he said. And so it did. Investors arrived first in trickles, then in waves, attracted by low taxes, minimal regulations, and the promise of an obedient workforce eager for change. Factories rose where rice paddies once flowed. Neon lights replaced lantern glow. Streets filled with languages from across the world. A new sound echoed in the air: ambition. Soon, more special economic zones followed along the coast. Xiamen, Zhuhai, Shantuan. In them, China rehearsed its future. The world peered in with fascination. A socialist nation embracing the rhythms of capitalism. It sounded like fiction, yet factories kept rising, and trade ships kept coming. Meanwhile, far from the bustling ports, another quiet revolution was reshaping the countryside: the collectivized communes. Mao's once sacred model of rural life began to unravel. Instead of working for the nebulous collective, villagers received plots of land to manage themselves. Responsibility returned to the hands of families who had waited decades to reclaim it. Freedom, modest but meaningful, seeped into the soil. Harvests surged. Wheat and rice filled granaries once again. Famines that had haunted China for centuries faded like ghosts at dawn. As the fields revived, so did the minds of a generation long silenced. Students who had been exiled to remote villages during the Cultural Revolution returned to the cities, carrying with them the hunger of lost years. Universities reopened their doors. Entrance exams once banned were reinstated, and millions competed for the right to learn. Beijing, Shanghai, Nanjing campuses buzzed with voices that had been suppressed but not broken. They debated politics, philosophy, economic. They whispered of democracy, justice, and a future unshackled from fear. Their dreams were fragile embers easily extinguished, but under Deng's reforms they glowed brighter than ever before. Beyond China's borders, the world shifted as well. In Indochina, the friendship between China and communist Vietnam fractured. Vietnam aligned itself with the Soviet Union, threatening China's regional influence. When Vietnamese troops invaded Cambodia, toppling the Khmer Rouge, China's brutal yet strategic ally, Deng responded with steel. In 1979, he ordered a limited invasion of Vietnam, expecting a quick, symbolic victory. Instead, the People's Liberation Army found itself fighting seasoned Vietnamese soldiers hardened by decades of war. China suffered staggering losses, around 20,000 casualties. The defeat exposed the player as a relic of the past, ill-equipped and poorly trained. It was a bitter lesson, but Deng took it as only he could. A problem to fix. And so the military would be modernized, reformed, rebuilt, another piece of old China being torn down so something stronger could be assembled. The paradox of Deng Xiaoping had become clear. He welcomed the world but crushed dissent. He revived the economy but preserved the party's unchallenged power. He opened China's doors while reinforcing its walls. The country was growing, awakening, trembling with possibility, and yet every step forward was watched, measured, controlled by the same hands guiding the transformation. And still, the people believed. Still, they hoped. Because for the first time in decades, the future of China did not feel like a sentence, it felt like a question. The 1980s dawned over China like a fragile sunrise, soft at the edges, bright with promise, and yet casting long shadows where the light could not reach. The world, once wary of the sleeping giant, now turned its gaze toward a nation awakening with unsettling speed. Deng Xiaoping, his hair thinning and his steps growing slower, nevertheless moved with the urgency of a man racing against time. Reform, he believed, must be fast enough to lift 1 billion lives, yet cautious enough to avoid chaos. He walked a tightrope no leader had ever dared to walk, balancing the discipline of a one-party state with the unleashed forces of semi-capitalist ambition. Foreign leaders lined up at Beijing's gates, British prime ministers, Japanese leaders, French presidency, then Queen Elizabeth II, all shook hands with the man reshaping China's destiny. Cameras captured Deng smiling politely, his eyes sharp behind the warmth. He was not searching for admiration. He was securing China's place in a world that suddenly needed it. But behind the confident facade, China carried secrets, contradictions that pulsed beneath the surface. The most controversial of these came in 1980, a policy born not of ideology but of fear. China's population had doubled in 3 decades, surging toward 1 billion souls. The government saw danger in every newborn, danger of famine, poverty, instability. And so the one-child policy was declared. It fell like a decree from heaven, unyielding and absolute. Urban families were told that a second child would bring fines, punishment, social shame. In remote villages, whispers grew into horror, stories, forced abortions, sterilizations, pregnancies hidden like contraband. A generation would be shaped by this policy, millions of only children bearing the weight of their parents' hopes, and a gender imbalance that would haunt the country for decades. The party spoke of responsibility. Many felt only loss. Yet, paradoxically, women were also rising. Mao had once proclaimed that women hold up half the sky, and by the late 1970s, his words had begun to manifest. Laws on marriage and property had given women greater rights. In the cities, nearly 90% of women were in the workforce: doctors, teachers, engineers, factory leaders. In 1980, China astonishingly became one of the very first nations to ratify the UN Convention on Eliminating Discrimination Against Women. But in the countryside, old traditions clung like stubborn roots. Patriarchal customs, poverty, and the priority of sons over daughters cast long shadows. Progress had begun, but unevenly, imperfectly, painfully. Meanwhile, the growing economy stirred expectations far beyond material wealth. In the buzzing dormitories of Beijing and Shanghai universities, students debated ideas that had been forbidden for a generation. Words like rights, transparency, freedom, and democracy no longer felt foreign, they felt necessary. For these young minds, the symbol of change was a man named Hu Yaobang, Deng's trusted ally and now the general secretary of the party. He was everything the ossified leadership was not: open, outspoken, empathetic. He pushed against corruption, challenged the privileged princelings, and encouraged intellectual openness. People adored him. Students chanted his name. Reformers whispered hopes that he would one day inherit Deng's mantle. But ideals have always been dangerous currency in China. In 1986, discontent bubbled into student demonstrations across the country, passionate, desperate for a nation that matched its new ambitions. When Deng demanded the protests be crushed, Hu Yaobang refused. That refusal sealed his fate. He was forced to resign, humiliated before colleagues he had once led. The light he carried dimmed but never died. 2 years later, during a Politburo meeting thick with stale air and old resentments, Hu Yaobang collapsed, his heart giving out where his words no longer could. His death spread through China like a shockwave. Students poured onto the streets with grief that quickly evolved into anger. Crowds formed not out of defiance, but out of mourning for a man they believed had been punished for his integrity. Tiananmen Square became the beating heart of that emotion, a place where candles flickered beside banners, where chants of remembrance turned into demands for change. That it was a moment charged with electricity, the kind that precedes either transformation or tragedy. The government felt the tremor, the world watched, and China stood on the edge of a precipice that no one, not even Deng, fully understood. The storm was gathering. The air in Beijing changed the moment Hu Yaobang died. It wasn't a sound or a sight, rather, a shift in the collective breath of a city that had learned to hold its grief close, but who had not been an ordinary man. To the youth who had come of age during Deng's reforms, Hu Yaobang had been a symbol, a whisper of what China might one day become, and now he was gone. Within hours, flowers began to appear in the streets, white chrysanthemums, the traditional tribute to the departed. Students marched quietly, holding portraits of Hu as if carrying a torch through darkness. They gathered in front of his home first, then at universities, and finally they drifted toward the vast, echoing openness of Tiananmen Square. What began as mourning soon transformed into something else. Tens of thousands filled the square, a tide of humanity, restless, hopeful, and heartbreakingly sincere. They came not with weapons or slogans of violence, but with notebooks, poems, banners, and open hands. They spoke of corruption, of transparency, of freedom, of futures they yearned to claim. Some held signs asking simply for dialogue, others carried banners demanding democracy, but most were driven by a single belief that the death of Hu Yaobang should not end in silence. In that sprawling plaza, under the watchful stone face of the monument to the people's heroes, the students felt a unity rare in China's long troubled history. Newspapers called it a protest. Those present called it awakening. Exactly 70 years after the protests of May 4th, the square once again pulsed with the heartbeat of youth. On May 13th, a group of students, frail but resolute, began a hunger strike. Their voices shook as they spoke for the cameras. We want democracy. We want freedom of speech. We do not want to overthrow the government. We want our government to reform to keep its promises. Their words drifted into radios, into homes, into villages hundreds of miles away. Suddenly, China was listening. Suddenly the world was listening to. Inside Zhongnanhai, behind guarded walls and closed doors, the leadership fractured. Some saw the students as misguided but sincere. Others saw them as a spark that could ignite chaos, reminiscent of the Cultural Revolution. Deng Xiaoping, old and weary, felt the tremors of instability more sharply than anyone. He knew how quickly idealism could turn into anarchy. His instincts shaped by war, purges, and revolution hardened. He believed China could not afford disorder. Not now, not ever. Into this storm stepped Xiao Jiang, the new general secretary, a man torn between his loyalty to Deng and his empathy for the young faces filling the square. On May 19th, long past midnight, he walked into the protest camp under dim streetlights, accompanied by almost no security. Students looked up, astonished. Their leader, one of the highest figures in China, had come to speak to them, not from a podium, but face to face. Zhao's voice quivered, weighed down by a sorrow he could not fully hide. We are already old, he said, looking at the crowd, his eyes bright with tears. You are young, you must live. Don't sacrifice yourselves. It was not a speech, it was a goodbye. The next morning the hardliners prevailed. Li Peng, stern, chain-bound to orthodoxy, convinced Deng that leniency would unravel everything. Martial law was declared. Troops began moving toward Beijing. The ring tightened around the square. The students refused to leave. Days passed in tense stalemate. Soldiers hesitated. Parents pleaded. The atmosphere thickened with fear and defiance to forces, pushing against each other until the inevitable breaking point arrived. And then it came. On the night of June 3rd, the city shuddered. Gunfire cracked through the darkness like shattering glass. Tanks rumbled down Chang'an Avenue, their treads crushing bicycles, barricades, and the last fragile illusions of compromise. Civilians rushed to block the soldiers, shouting, crying, pleading, unarmed bodies standing against machines built for war. The troops opened fire. Chaos swallowed the night. Students scrambled, clutching each other, screaming warnings, dragging the injured to makeshift medical tents lit by weak flashlights. The air thickened with smoke, tear gas, and the metallic scent of blood. The roar of engines drowned out the cries. By dawn, the square, once a symbol of hopelessly silent, emptied by force. The government declared that order had been restored. Official numbers said 218 civilians and 23 security personnel had died. Few believed that. Most knew the truth was buried beneath the roar of tanks. But out of the carnage emerged one image the government could not contain. A man in a white shirt, carrying nothing but 2 shopping bags, walked into the street and stood before a column of tanks. The machine halted, engines growled. The man did not move. No one knew his name. No one ever would. But the world called him Tank Man, the man who dared to stop history with the courage of a single ordinary soul. His defiance traveled across oceans, across borders, across time, a reminder that even in moments of overwhelming force, a single human being could still stand for something larger than fear. Deng Xiaoping watched the aftermath from behind closed doors, his face carved with exhaustion. He called the protests a counter-revolutionary rebellion. Xiao Jiang was stripped of power, locked away in quiet confinement for the rest of his life. Li Peng remained firm, unrepentant, the steward of a decision that would stain history. The world condemned China. Sanctions followed. Investment fled. Diplomats spoke with tightened voices. For the first time in years, Beijing stood alone, again isolated, wounded, defiant. China's great experiment seemed ready to collapse. But in the shadows of disgrace and silence, Deng Xiaoping was not finished. He was old, but not done, tired, but still dangerous. defeated publicly, but burning privately with resolve. He would be back, and when he returned, he would reshape China once more, this time with a force no one could resist. In the months that followed the massacre, China felt like a nation holding its breath underwater. The streets looked normal, the factories still hummed, the newspapers still printed the same carefully crafted lines, but beneath the routine, something essential had broken. A quiet fear seeped into daily life, heavy, suffocating, unavoidable. The world recoiled. Foreign investors retreated with the disgust of a hand pulling away from fire. Western leaders lined up to denounce China's actions. Sanctions hit hard. The World Bank froze loans. For the first time in years, China faced the cold edge of global isolation again. Inside the party, the atmosphere grew thick with caution. Reform seemed dangerous now, like a door that once opened hope but now led directly to chaos. The hardliners believed they had been proven right. The people needed discipline, not dreams. Control, not conversation. Too many. It looked as if Deng's grand vision had finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. But Deng Xiaoping, old and nearly invisible in public, was not finished. He did not roar. He did not issue a decree. He waited. He watched China's economy slow to a crawl. He watched factories stall. He watched unemployment rise. He watched the sparkle in people's eyes dim again. He watched the party cling to fear while the country edged toward stagnation. And then, at the age of 87, he made his final move. In early 1992, when winter still clung to the land, Deng left Beijing quietly and embarked on what would become legendary: the Southern Tour. It was not an official state visit. There were no speeches broadcast live. He simply traveled to Shenzhen, to Zhuhai, to Shanghai, walking through the special economic zones he had created a decade earlier. But wherever he went, crowds followed. Workers pressed close to glimpse him. Factory managers bowed until their foreheads nearly touched the ground. Local officials trembled, sensing the weight of history on the old man's shoulders. Deng moved slowly, sometimes supported by aides, but his voice, when he spoke, cut with the clarity of youth. Boldness, he said. We must have boldness in reform. He ridiculed fears of capitalism. What did it matter, he asked, whether a cat was black or white? As long as it caught mice, it was a good cat. Economics must serve results, not ideology. The hardliners bristled in Beijing, whispering among themselves, but Deng's momentum had become unstoppable. Everywhere he went, he breathed life into the reformers. He reminded them that China had climbed out of centuries of poverty not through dogma, but through courage, the courage to change. By the time he returned to the capital, the entire political landscape had shifted beneath the feet of his opponents. Later that year, the Party Congress declared China a socialist market economy. It was a phrase crafted to sound safe, loyal to the revolution, but everyone knew what it meant. Markets would decide. Businesses would rise and fall. Private enterprise would grow. Capitalism, by any other name, had entered China. Factories once owned by the state were privatized or allowed to die. New companies sprang up in industrial zones like sparks leaping from a fire. Rural workers poured into cities by the tens of millions, chasing jobs, chasing money, chasing futures they had never dared to dream of. Growth exploded. In 1990, China's GDP growth had withered to just under 4%. By 1992, it vaulted to 14.2%, a number so astonishing it made headlines around the globe. For the next decade, China would soar on a wave of ambition unmatched in modern history. Meanwhile, the greatest transformation unfolded quietly, far from the bright lights of Shanghai and Guangzhou. According to the World Bank, in 1990, more than 80% of Chinese citizens lived in extreme poverty. Over the next 30 years, that number fell to zero, a feat some economists would call the greatest anti-poverty achievement ever recorded. But there was another side to the miracle. As price controls disappeared, many families suddenly faced harsh new realities. Rent soared, food prices climbed, state jobs vanished overnight, and with them the iron rice bowl: guaranteed housing, guaranteed work, guaranteed security. Some thrived, many suffered. Inequality rose like a tide. Pollution choked skies and rivers. Corruption flourished. Rural migrants, strangers in their own country, flooded the booming cities, only to find themselves blocked by the hukou system from accessing schools, hospitals, or housing. They built China's new skylines but slept six to a room, excluded from the prosperity they helped create. China had leaped forward, but it had done so unevenly, brutally, magnificently. And then, in 1997, the man who had steered China through its most turbulent transformation passed away. Deng Xiaoping died at the age of 92. The nation grieved in a controlled, measured way, but beneath the surface, emotions ran deeper. Admiration, resentment, gratitude, anger, all tangled into a single, complicated truth. He had given China prosperity. He had denied it democracy. He had lifted millions out of poverty. He had ordered tanks against his own people. He had been both a visionary and a guardian of a system that brooked no challenge. He was, undeniably, one of the most influential figures of the 20th century and one of the most controversial. His legacy was set by iron, but China's story was far from over. New leader was rising. Jiang Zemin, conservative, oddly charming, armed with a reformer's instincts and a bureaucrat's caution. He would inherit a nation transformed, but still searching for its soul. And as the world watched, China continued marching toward a future no one could yet define. When Deng Xiaoping's ashes settled and the mourning banners came down, China did not pause. A nation of more than a billion moved forward because history in China never stops, it accelerates. Jiang Zemin, with his square glasses and wide, theatrical smile, took the helm. He was no revolutionary, no battlefield commander, no ideological seer. He was a technocrat shaped by textbooks and bureaucracy, not rifles and slogans. Yet he carried something vital, the ability to hold China steady while its economy roared like a newborn storm. Under Jiang's cautious stewardship, China continued its delicate dance, embracing the world with one hand, tightening domestic control with the other. It was the quiet continuation of Deng's strategy: hide strength, bide time, and the world, hungry for cheap goods and booming markets, played along. Then came 1997, a year dripping with symbolism. Under a hot, humid Hong Kong sky, British flags were lowered for the last time. China reclaimed the glittering city it had lost more than a century ago, ending 156 years of colonial rule. Millions watched the ceremony live. Fireworks lit the harbor. Soldiers stood like statues, and for the first time in generations, China felt the weight of humiliation lift. Just a little. 2 years later, Macau returned as well, one more piece of a fractured past. Restored, the world marveled. Could a communist state really embrace capitalism so seamlessly? Could a rising middle class live without demanding political change? Western leaders insisted that prosperity would inevitably make China freer, more open, more democratic. But inside the country, the opposite was already taking shape. As China opened its doors economically, it tightened them politically. Dissent was monitored. Voices were traced. Ideas were filtered. The Great Firewall rose, vast, invisible, impenetrable, designed not to keep enemies out, but to keep foreign ideas away from the minds of Chinese citizens. The internet, still young and full of promise, was tamed and patrolled like a wild animal forced into obedience. Meanwhile, far from the shining towers of Beijing, discontent simmered in Tibet and Xinjiang. Protests erupted. Beijing responded with force, firm, unshakable, unapologetic. The party promised stability and order would be maintained at any cost. Yet the economy continued to climb. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, a moment that changed the global economy forever. Suddenly, the world's factories moved east. Western brands flowed into Chinese malls. Chinese goods flooded every corner of the globe. China grew faster than anyone had believed possible. 10%, 12%, 14% year after year. The dragon soared, but towering smokestacks scarred the skies with ash. Rivers darkened with industrial waste. A new sickness, born of rapid growth, settled into China's lungs and water and soil. Still the world clapped, astonished, and then 2008 arrived, a year burned into memory. China hosted the Beijing Olympics, an event so grand and meticulously choreographed it left audiences stunned. The opening ceremony was not merely a show, it was a declaration. A new China has arrived. Soon after, the unimaginable happened. China overtook Japan to become the world's second largest economy, leaving only the United States above it. A century earlier, China had been a broken empire. Now it was a titan. But prosperity did not bring the political changes many had predicted. Instead, the state became stronger, surveillance grew sharper, propaganda more sophisticated, dissent more dangerous. The party promised stability, prosperity, and national pride, and the people, exhausted by decades of chaos, accepted the bargain. For some, it was security. For others, a cage built of progress. And then, in 2012, a new figure stepped on screen, a man with broad shoulders, steady posture, and an expression carved from granite. Xi Jinping. He did not rise with fanfare. He did not shout or boast. He took power quietly, almost gently, as if he were settling into a chair that had always been waiting for him. Yet beneath that calm exterior, the world sensed something shifting. He was not Deng, he was not Jiang, he was something else entirely. China, now a century removed from the fall of its last emperor, was no longer the wounded giant of old. It was strong, confident, and unafraid to show its power. Its cities sparkled with glass and steel. Its trains sliced across the land faster than planes. Its companies dominated global markets. Its influence seeped into every continent. Xi Jinping would guide this new China into the era of great power. Rivalry. The long march from feudal empire to revolutionary chaos to economic powerhouse had reached a new chapter, one shaped not by poverty or survival, but by ambition. The Middle Kingdom had returned to the center of global affairs, not as a symbol of ancient glory, but as an engine of modern power. It had risen through famine and fire, through revolution and repression, through hope and heartbreak. The journey had been violent, triumphant, tragic, miraculous. And now, as the century turned and the world watched with wary awe, one truth echoed through history. China, once broken, now stood tall again, not quietly, not apologetically, but with the unshakable knowledge that its story was far from over.